You chose the wrong life. My father's words hung in the air of their immaculate suburban living room, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to comment on the weather. Beside him on the pristine white sofa, my mother nodded in solemn agreement, her lips pressed into a thin line of disappointment. I was 26 years old, and I had just told them I was turning down a prestigious law firm position, the culmination of 7 years of higher education they had partially funded, to pursue a career in emergency medicine, specifically, to accept a position with Doctors Without Borders that would send me to crisis zones around the world. It's not the wrong life, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. It's just not the life you planned for me. We invested in your future, Michael, my father continued, his voice hardening. Harvard undergraduate, Columbia Law. Do you have any idea what that cost us? What we sacrificed? I did know. The cost had been mentioned frequently throughout my education, not just the financial burden, though that was substantial even with scholarships, but the social capital my parents had expended. The calls to alumni connections, the networking events, the carefully cultivated relationships with influential partners at top firms. What they had never seemed to recognize was the cost to me. The anxiety attacks during law school that had sent me to the campus health center, where a kind physician had taken the time to really talk to me. The growing realization during my summer internships that corporate law made me profoundly unhappy. The volunteer shifts at a free clinic that had ignited something inside me I couldn't ignore. I'll pay back every cent, I promised. I've already been accepted to an accelerated medical program for people with prior degrees. 3 years instead of 4, then residency. This isn't about the money, my mother interjected, though her tone suggested otherwise. It's about stability, security, building the kind of life that people respect. People respect doctors, I pointed out, immediately regretting the defensive note in my voice. Doctors who practice in good hospitals, who build practices in good neighborhoods, who contribute to society in stable, predictable ways. My father's emphasis made it clear what he thought of crisis medicine, not wanderers who throw themselves into war zones and disease outbreaks. I'll be helping people who desperately need it, I said. Isn't that what you always taught me? To use my privileges to make a difference? We meant through pro bono legal work, through serving on charitable boards, through donations from your substantial income. My mother shook her head. Not through this. The conversation circled for another hour, growing increasingly tense. My parents employed every tactic in their arsenal: guilt, reason, emotional appeals, veiled threats about financial support. I held firm, though each exchange left me more drained than the last. Finally, my father stood, signaling the discussion was over. If this is truly your decision, we won't stop you. But understand this, you are choosing a path we cannot support. Not financially, not emotionally. What does that mean? I asked, though I already knew. It means you're on your own, my mother said, her voice catching slightly despite her composed expression. We've done everything we can to set you up for success, and you're determined to throw it away. We can't watch that happen. You're cutting me off because I want to be a doctor instead of a lawyer? The absurdity of it might have been comical if it weren't so painful. We're stepping back because you've made it clear our guidance means nothing to you, my father corrected. When you come to your senses, our door will be open. Until then, you've chosen your path. Walk it alone. I left their house that evening with a strange mixture of devastation and relief. The break had been cleaner than I expected, the lines clearly drawn. No more pretending to be someone I wasn't. No more hiding my true aspiration. No more walking the careful tightrope of partial authenticity that had characterized my relationship with my parents for years. Freedom, it turned out, was both exhilarating and terrifying. The next 8 years passed in a blur of intensity and purpose. Medical school was grueling, but fulfilling in ways law school had never been. I thrived in the accelerated program, graduating near the top of my class before specializing in emergency and trauma medicine. My residency at a busy urban hospital in Chicago provided exactly the high-stakes, fast-paced environment where I felt most alive. True to their word, my parents withdrew all financial support. I took out loans for medical school, worked hospital shifts whenever possible, and lived in a tiny apartment with 2 other medical students to make ends meet. The lifestyle was a far cry from the luxury my law career would have provided, but I never regretted my decision, not even when the wedding invitations for cousins and family friends arrived addressed only to my parents with no mention of me. Not when I learned through mutual connections that my father had told colleagues his only son was finding himself rather than admit I'd chosen a different path than the one he prescribed. Not when my carefully chosen birthday and Christmas gifts were returned and opened. I sent updates anyway for the first few years, brief emails about my progress in school. A graduation announcement. They didn't acknowledge a new address card when I moved for residency, eventually. I stopped, the silence became a habit, then a fact of life. My work with Doctors Without Borders began with short-term assignments during residency breaks, 2 weeks in Haiti after a devastating hurricane, a month in Sierra Leone during a disease outbreak. After completing my residency, I committed to longer deployments, 6 months in a refugee camp on the Syrian border, a year in South Sudan, treating casualties of a civil conflict while training local medical staff. The work was challenging beyond anything I could have imagined. The conditions were often primitive, the hours endless, the ethical dilemmas heart-wrenching. There were nights I lay awake on my narrow cot, listening to distant gunfire or the sounds of suffering from the medical tent, wondering if my parents had been right after all, if I had chosen the wrong life. But then morning would come, and with it the reminder of why I was there. The young mother whose difficult delivery resulted in a healthy baby against all odds. The child whose broken leg I had set, now running across a dusty compound. The local nurse whose skills had grown under my mentorship, now confidently managing cases I would have handled alone months earlier. In these moments, I knew with bone-deep certainty that I had made the right choice. That the wrong life according to my parents' narrow definition was exactly the right life for me. I was 34, nearing the end of a 14-month assignment in northern Ethiopia, when the first email from my father arrived in 8 years. The subject line was simply, "Your mother." My hands shook slightly as I opened it on my satellite phone. The connection painfully slow in our remote location. "Michael, your mother has been diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. Treatment options are limited. Her oncologist estimates 8 to 14 months with aggressive intervention. She would like to see you." Dad, no pleasantries. No inquiries about my life or work. Just the stark facts and an implicit summons. Classic Robert Harrington communication. I stared at the screen for a long time, emotions churning. Shock at the diagnosis. My mother was only 62. Had always been conscientious about her health. Grief for the suffering she would endure. Anger at the clinical tone of the message, devoid of any acknowledgement of the years of silence. And beneath it all, a complicated tangle of love and hurt that had never fully resolved despite the distance I had put between myself and my parents. My supervisor found me still sitting in the communications tent an hour later, staring at the now dark screen of my phone. "Bad news from home?" she asked, her South African accent gentle with concern. "My mother has cancer," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "Pancreatic. Stage 3. Megan's expression softened with understanding. She had been an emergency physician for 20 years, had seen more death than most people could imagine. She knew what the diagnosis meant. "When will you leave?" "I haven't decided if I, Michael." Her interruption was firm but kind. "You will go. Whatever your relationship with your parents, and I know it's complicated, you won't forgive yourself. If you don't, we can manage here until your replacement arrives next month." She was right, of course. Whatever had transpired between us, whatever hurtful words had been spoken, my mother was dying. And despite everything, I loved her. I loved them both. Even as I had chosen to build a life they couldn't understand or accept. I replied to my father's email that night, using the same direct tone he had employed. "Dad, I'm sorry to hear about Mom. I'm currently finishing an assignment in Ethiopia, but can arrange to return to the States within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Please send details about her treatment plan and schedule so I can plan accordingly." Michael's response came the next day, with surprising speed given our previous 8 years of silence. "Treatment begins next week at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Your mother has requested you stay at the house rather than a hotel. Let us know your arrival details, and we will arrange transportation from the airport." Dad, it took 10 days to organize my departure from Ethiopia, handing over patients, completing necessary documentation, training staff who would assume my responsibilities. My colleagues threw a small goodbye party the night before I left, presenting me with handmade gifts from local artisans and extracted promises to return if possible. "You've changed lives here," Megan told me as we shared a rare beer outside the compound. "Whatever happens back home, remember that." The journey from rural Ethiopia to suburban Connecticut was a study in contrasts. From dusty roads and makeshift clinics to pristine highways and state-of-the-art medical centers. From a region where clean water was a luxury to a neighborhood where lawns were meticulously maintained by professional landscapers. From a place where my skills were desperately needed to one where physicians were plentiful and well compensated. My father was waiting at the airport, standing stiffly near the baggage claim in a pressed suit despite the late hour. He had aged noticeably more gray in his dark hair, deeper lines around his mouth and eyes. Still handsome, still imposing, but showing the wear of his 65 years, and I suspected the stress of my mother's illness. "Michael," he extended his hand formally, as if greeting a business associate rather than his son. "Thank you for coming." I shook his hand, then surprised us both by pulling him into a brief, awkward hug. "How is she?" Holding up. The first round of chemo has been difficult. He took my worn duffel bag, eyebrows lifting slightly at its modest size and battered condition. Is this all you brought? I travel light these days, I explained, following him toward the parking garage. Most places I work, laundry facilities are basic at best. You learn to manage with less. He nodded without commenting, but I could read the judgment in his posture. In his world, success was measured partly by possessions: the right car, the right clothes, the right address. My minimalist existence would register as failure rather than adaptation to different circumstances. The drive to their home in Westport passed mostly in silence, broken only by my father's brief updates about my mother's treatment plan. Surgery wasn't an option due to the location of the tumor. The oncologist was cautiously optimistic about a new combination therapy. But the statistics remained grim. My mother was determined to beat the odds. I had expected nothing less. Elizabeth Harrington approached cancer the same way she approached everything in life: as a challenge to be overcome through proper planning, the right connections, and sheer force of will. The house looked exactly as I remembered: a stately colonial onto manicured acres, illuminated by tasteful landscape lighting even at midnight. Inside, the decor had been updated, but remained in keeping with my mother's preference for traditional elegance. Family photos lined the entryway, charting my progress from smiling toddler to serious law student. Nothing more recent, of course. Nothing to indicate the life I had actually chosen. Sleep came fitfully. Jet lag compounded by the emotional weight of being back in my parents' house after so many years away. I woke before dawn, showered quickly, and pulled on comfortable, worn jeans and a simple button-down shirt, standard off-duty attire for me, but noticeably casual in a household where my father wore suits to weekend breakfast and my mother coordinated her loungewear with her decor. At precisely 7 o'clock, I made my way downstairs, following the scent of coffee to the kitchen. And there she was, seated at the breakfast nook with a cup of tea, looking simultaneously like the mother I remembered and a stranger. Elizabeth Harrington had always been beautiful in a classic, refined way. Tall and slender, with chestnut hair carefully maintained and tasteful makeup applied even for the most casual occasions. The woman before me retained echoes of that beauty, but cancer had already taken its toll. Her face was gaunter, her complexion sallow despite subtle makeup. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her silk blouse hanging loosely from diminished shoulders. But her posture remained perfect, her gaze direct and assessing as I entered the room. "Michael," she said, her voice warmer than I had expected. "You came." "Of course I came, Mom." I moved toward her, uncertain of my welcome until she extended her arms for an embrace. I hugged her carefully, shocked by the fragility of her frame. "I'm so sorry about your diagnosis." "Well, we'll beat it," she said with the determined optimism I remembered well. "Dr. Levinson has an excellent track record with cases like mine, and I'm following every protocol to the letter." She gestured to the place setting opposite hers. "Have some breakfast, Mrs. Daniel still comes in 3 mornings a week. She made your favorite scones." I sat, accepting a cup of coffee poured from a silver pot that likely cost more than a month's salary for most of the local healthcare workers I had just left behind in Ethiopia. "They look delicious. Thank you for remembering." A shadow crossed her face. "I remember everything about you, Michael, even if you think I don't." Before I could respond to this unexpected opening, my father entered the kitchen, immaculate in a charcoal suit despite having no apparent plans to leave the house. "Good morning," he said, pouring coffee for himself before sitting at the head of the table. "I see you to have reacquainted yourselves." "We're working on it," my mother replied, a note of steel beneath her pleasant tone. Michael was about to tell me about his work abroad. "Weren't you, dear?" And just like that, we were launched into the familiar dance of Harrington family breakfast conversation, polite, substantive, but carefully controlled to avoid any topic too controversial or emotional. I provided a sanitized version of my work with Doctors Without Borders, emphasizing the medical challenges rather than the political realities or human suffering. My father asked pointed questions about the organization, structure, and funding. My mother inquired about the climate and local customs of the regions where I'd worked. No one mentioned our estrangement. No one referenced the wrong life I had supposedly chosen. No one acknowledged the elephant in the room, that it had taken a terminal diagnosis to bring their only son back to their table. As my mother rose to take her medication, steadying herself briefly against the table, I realized with sudden clarity what was happening. We were pretending. All of us. Pretending that the last 8 years hadn't happened. Pretending that I was a son they had wanted me to be, just home from a slightly unusual assignment rather than a fundamentally different life path. Pretending that we had time to gradually rebuild bridges that had been thoroughly burned. But we didn't have time. My mother was dying. and whatever healing might be possible needed to begin now, not after weeks of polite fiction. "I've missed you both," I said abruptly, interrupting my father's careful inquiry about the Ethiopian healthcare system. "Even though I don't regret my choices, I've missed being your son." My mother's hand froze halfway to her mouth, water glass suspended in midair. My father's expression shifted from mild interest to wariness. "Michael," he began, his tone cautioning against disruption of the careful script we had been following. "No, Dad, we need to talk about this. Really talk." I looked directly at my mother. "You have cancer. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. Which means our time for pretending everything is fine, for avoiding difficult conversations, is extremely limited." My bluntness, a trait developed through years of delivering difficult news to patients and families in crisis, clearly startled them both. My mother set down her glass carefully, composing herself. "You're right, of course," she said after a moment. "Though I would have preferred to ease into this conversation after you'd had more time to settle in." "I'm not staying long enough to settle in," I replied, gentling my tone slightly. "I have 2 weeks before I need to report to my next assignment. If we're going to address the past 8 years, it needs to happen now." My father's jaw tightened, a sure sign of displeasure. "Your mother is ill, Michael. This isn't the time to rehash old disagreements." "It's exactly the time," I countered. "Because there might not be another." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. My mother broke it finally, her voice steadier than I expected. "Your father and I owe you an apology," she said, the words clearly difficult for her. "We handled your career decision poorly. Very poorly. We were wrong to cut you off," my father added, each word seeming to cost him considerable effort. "Wrong too. To say you had chosen the wrong life?" I studied them both, these proud, stubborn people who had shaped me in ways both obvious and subtle. Their apology was belated, imperfect, clearly motivated at least partly by my mother's diagnosis. But it was also genuine. A crack in the facade of certainty they had maintained about the correct path for my life. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot to hear, but..." My mother's perception was undiminished by illness. "I sense there's more you want to say. But I need to understand why you've reached out now. Is it just because of the cancer? Or has something else changed?" My parents exchanged a glance. One of those wordless communications developed over decades of marriage. My father nodded slightly, ceding the conversation to my mother. "The cancer was a catalyst," she admitted. "Facing mortality has a way of clarifying priorities. But we had already been reconsidering our position." "What do you mean?" "We saw you on the news," my father said unexpectedly. 6 months ago. That earthquake in Indonesia. I remembered it vividly, a 7.5 magnitude quake that had devastated remote island communities. Our medical team had been airlifted in within 48 hours, setting up field hospitals in areas unreachable by road. The international news coverage had been extensive. "You were interviewed briefly," my mother continued, talking about the challenges of providing emergency care in such conditions. You looked so capable, so assured, so clearly in your element." "It was the first time we'd seen you in years," my father added. "The first real glimpse of the life you'd built without us, and..." I prompted when he fell silent. "And it was humbling," my mother said, surprising me again, "to see that you had built something meaningful without our approval or support. That perhaps there were different kinds of success than the ones we had envisioned for you." "We were beginning to discuss reaching out," my father explained, though we hadn't quite determined how to bridge such a long silence. "Then your mother's diagnosis came, and suddenly the timeline accelerated considerably. I absorbed this information, this unexpected revelation that the thaw had begun before the medical crisis. That perhaps our reunion wasn't solely motivated by my mother's illness, but by a genuine reconsideration of their rigid positions. So where do we go from here?" I asked, looking between them. 2 weeks isn't much time to bridge 8 years of separation." "No," my father agreed. "But it's a start, and there's another reason we asked you to come beyond reconciliation." Something in his tone alerted me. The practiced nonchalance that had always signaled an important matter when I was growing up. "What reason?" My mother straightened in her chair, summoning dignity despite her evident fatigue. "We need your help, Michael. Your professional opinion about my treatment options." "You want my medical opinion?" I asked, surprised. "I'm an emergency doctor, not an oncologist." "But you understand medical jargon," my father said. "You can translate what the specialists are saying into terms we can truly comprehend." My mother's expression grew vulnerable, an unusual sight. "The oncologists recommend different approaches. One suggests aggressive experimental treatment. Another favors quality of life over extension." "We're lost." I hesitated, aware of the complex dynamics. This wasn't just a medical consultation. It was also an olive branch, a way for my parents to acknowledge the value of the path I'd chosen. Yet involving myself in my mother's care risked entangling my professional judgment with familial emotions. I'll review your records. I agree finally. But I'll need to be completely honest with you both, even when the truth is difficult. That's exactly why we need you, my mother said. Everyone else treats me like I'm made of glass. Over the next week, I immersed myself in her medical file, scans, lab results, consultation notes. The picture was grim but not without hope. The tumor had wrapped around critical blood vessels, making immediate surgery impossible. But new treatment protocols sometimes shrank such tumors enough for surgical intervention. I accompanied them to oncology appointments, asking the pointed questions they hadn't known to ask, translating complex medical information into understandable terms. My father watched me with growing respect, while my mother seemed relieved to have an advocate who understood both the medicine and her priorities. "What would you do?" she asked one evening as we sat in the garden. "If it were your diagnosis?" "I'd choose a clinical trial," I said after careful consideration. "It's aggressive, yes. The side effects will be brutal. But it offers the best chance of shrinking the tumor enough for potential surgery. And knowing you, Mom, you've never chosen the easy path when a harder one offered better odds." She smiled, reaching for my hand. "You do know me, don't you? Despite everything." "I know you both," I replied. "That's why I came back, even after everything that happened." The next morning, she informed her oncologist she was choosing the aggressive treatment protocol. The decision made, our focus shifted from clinical considerations to personal ones. The limited time we had to rebuild our family bonds, my planned 2-week visit stretched to 3, then 4. Each time I prepared to leave for my next assignment, some new development in my mother's treatment created a reason to stay a little longer. My supervisor at Doctors Without Borders was understanding, arranging for another physician to cover my next scheduled deployment. Family is important, Megan told me during our video call. Especially now, we'll hold your spot. The irony wasn't lost on me. Postponing humanitarian work my parents had once dismissed to help the very people who had rejected my choices. Yet something profound was happening during these unexpected weeks together. As my mother began the grueling treatment regimen, our conversations deepened. Late nights during her insomnia, early mornings, when nausea prevented sleep. These became precious opportunities for genuine connection. We discussed everything we'd avoided for 8 years, my experiences in crisis zones, their gradual recognition that success could take many forms, the pain of separation that had marked us all. "I was so afraid for you," my mother admitted during one prolonged conversation. "Not just for your physical safety, but that you'd throw away your potential. I couldn't see that you were fulfilling your potential, just differently than I'd imagined." My father, initially more reserved, gradually opened up as well. One evening in his study, he showed me a folder containing every news article, every organizational newsletter that had mentioned my work. "You thought we weren't paying attention," he said quietly. "But we were, we just didn't know how to bridge the gap we created." 6 weeks into my stay, we received the first piece of genuinely good news. My mother's tumor had responded to treatment, shrinking enough that surgery might eventually become possible. The road ahead remained difficult, the prognosis still serious. But a path forward had emerged where none had existed before. That night, as we celebrated with a quiet dinner at home, my father raised his glass. "To second chances," he said. "For your mother's health and for our family." I lifted my glass to meet his. "To choosing the right life," I replied. "Whatever form that takes." My mother smiled between us, frail but determined. And to the wisdom of recognizing it, however belatedly. I never returned to that next assignment. Instead, I arranged an extended leave of absence, accepting a part-time position at a local emergency department to maintain my skills while remaining close enough to oversee my mother's care. My parents' need for my help had created an unexpected bridge back to a family I thought I'd lost forever. Sometimes the most meaningful reconciliations come when we're needed most by those who once rejected us, not because they've completely changed, but because circumstances force a recognition of what truly matters. Not predetermined pause or societal expectations, but the deep, complicated bonds of family love that persist despite our differences. My mother's cancer had brought us full circle, transforming their dismissal of the wrong life into a desperate need for exactly the expertise that life had given me, and in that transformation, we all found healing that extended far beyond medical intervention alone.